Hi, and welcome to this talk on building accessible forms. In this session, you'll learn techniques to identify website and web application accessibility issues through examining HTML structure and by using the built-in accessibility tree tool available in your Evergreen browser DevTools. My name is Sean, and I work as a senior front-end web developer at Synopsys. At Synopsys, we create tools for developers to identify potential and existing security vulnerabilities. If you've ever used an antivirus software like McAfee, antivirus like ESET maybe, if you've ever used Windows before, you probably know about antivirus. Think about that, but with more features and with more levels of granularity. But before I get into any details of how we implemented accessible dynamic dropdowns, search, and upload components, let me preface this talk with a disclaimer that the slides you see here don't necessarily represent our upcoming version of our issue manager. For that reason, you might identify some accessibility concerns left unaddressed, and that's by design. I can't stress enough the importance of conducting your own user studies to determine potential accessibility issues with your website or web application. So many times do we make assumptions based on automated accessibility tools, such as Axe, which love it, DQ, thank you so much, but we do it to gain WCAG compliance, but we don't actually talk to our users. We're not actually testing with our users to determine their pain points. I highly suggest that you go and test with your own users and figure out what makes sense to you and what you want to prioritize in terms of accessibility, because you might not have time, like us, to address all of the accessibility concerns in your application or website. With that in mind, let's get started by taking a look at the product. Here you can see a screenshot of our cloud-based dashboard to manage issues. We call this Issue Manager. On the left-hand side, we have a traditional sidebar, including our primary navigation landmark, as well as the username avatar for the currently logged in user. With the main landmark, we have two dashboard widgets, one titled Scan Tracker and the other for displaying favorite projects. We can liken each of these dashboard widgets to the kinds of metrics we might see in antivirus software. Within Scan Tracker, we can see a list of recent scans to try to detect security flaws, as well as a number of useful metrics, including total scans, completed scans, and failed scans. Moving on to the favorite project widget, we show a list of cards, each associated with a pin project. Projects represent source code repositories, which get uploaded from our developer customers in a zip format. If you're familiar with distributed version control systems like Git, each project represents one of these repositories. Pictured in the screenshot next to each project listing, we see a dropdown with a branch icon next to the actively selected branch name. Below each project listing, we see a breakdown of issue severities detected for the most recent scan: high, medium, low, audit, and critical, each indicated with an abbreviation such as M, L, A, N, and so on. Finally, we see a link situated next to each individual project on the upper right-hand corner of each project card with a gear icon, taking us to the project's detailed settings page. Now that we understand the overall structure of our Issue Manager app, let's take a look at the first example of how we built accessibility into our forms by looking at the branch selector dropdown mentioned earlier. Again, our branch selector serves to identify to the developer the currently selected branch, which will be scanned, and is located next to each project card. Of particular note, we only display this branch dropdown when we have more than one branch, and that's detected by the uploaded source code, of course, the one that we uploaded in zip format. In cases where a repository only has one branch, as in main, and we can actually see this on the third example in the card here, we can see there's no dropdown, there's no indicator, there's no selecting a caret icon pointing down to say that this is a possibly opened dropdown. So if there is a main branch or a master branch and there are other branches, then we show that dropdown. But otherwise, we just show bolded text next to the current branch. Zooming in to the dropdown options available in our branch selector dropdown, we can see additional information appended to two options of the 8 options we have available. The second option on the slide here, you can see the text default appended, with the 7th option as well having the text preferred appended in parentheses. These indicate the first detected branch, usually main or master, and then the actively selected branch respectively. Finally, above all of the 8 branch options, we have the search ability, the search input, which dynamically filters branches by name. This is particularly useful for our developer customers who have monorepo projects with hundreds of different feature branches. Now, if you've ever done any kind of development, you probably know about feature branches. Basically, you have a branch that's associated with each individual feature that you're developing. And as you move through your progress, you might eventually merge that feature branch into your main branch. And what happens is usually those branches don't get deleted. So you can have hundreds and hundreds of branches available to you. And for our non-sighted users, we found this pretty important. So how do we make these dropdowns accessible to our developer customers? To understand that, let's take a look at the requirements we identified from our accessibility user testing. Through our accessibility user testing, we found that our developer customers requested 3 things. First of all, our customers wanted accessible keyboard shortcuts to navigate our dropdowns. Using the native select element provides this out of the box. Unfortunately, while the native select element does provide searching, we identified varying support for assisted users not knowing how to perform searches. For example, have you ever tried to search on a select element and find an option? Maybe it was your birthday, the day of the year, and did you know that you can just type in 01 to get the first day of the year? But sometimes you don't even know that this even exists. And unfortunately for us, we found that our users weren't aware, especially our non-sighted users and our assisted users didn't know about this ability. Recently, Edge has also introduced a new element called the select menu element, which does allow for enhanced accessibility and customization. But currently, Edge only supports this, and in Chrome, we need to enable a special feature flag to see it. Second of all, we identified that the dropdowns must be focusable. This means that when we open or close a dropdown, it must tell the screen reader which content got shown or hidden. Likewise, when we hide the dropdown content, we must also indicate to the screen reader that the content has closed and that it's no longer expanded. Both of these requirements encapsulate an overreaching theme that I want to outline here, which we call announceability. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be showing you code from our code base that uses a framework we use called Ember.js. If you're familiar with frameworks like Angular or Vue libraries like React, Ember offers very similar features, but with accessibility features built in, such as built-in loading states, error states, route changing announcements if you install an add-on, and more. Of course, like any tool, the tools that you see here, you can almost always find in your framework or Vue library of choice. For example, in the Ember ecosystem, to programmatically manage focus, we use an add-on called Ember Focus Trap. This is fairly new, and this comes in the form of a modifier. A modifier is something like more like a directive if you've used Angular or Vue. It basically adds an attribute that you can customize that adds certain behavior to an element. This particular add-on, though, modifies the tab index and also helps us to address accessibility concerns related to keyboard navigation for our dropdowns. Speaking of dropdowns, no, we didn't create our own, but rather we leveraged an existing dropdown component library, which addresses a large amount of our accessibility concerns out of the box. Focus management using the Ember Focus Trap add-on, which I just spoke about earlier. And I also want to show you that you can see in the screenshot, you can see the Power Select webpage. And in this webpage, we can also see a very similar dropdown to the one that we have in our dashboard. So if we compare this to the one that we showed you earlier, you can see there's a striking resemblance. For example, the upwards facing caret indicates that the dropdown is open. And then we also have, in addition to this, the search ability, but that doesn't actually show in the web page. To achieve the search, we use another add-on called Power Select with Search, which is available on GitHub and it's open sourced. But let's take a look at the code and I'll show you guys what we've done to implement this dropdown. So starting from the top, we have our branch selector, which is just a div, and we have this thing called ... attributes. The ... attributes lets us pass any what we call in Angular or Vue props, which are really just attributes. Again, this is kind of a theme here in the Ember world. It's a lot more compliant with web component specification. So we call them attributes, although they're potentially going to call them props. Anyway, we have if we go and we look at this component, we can actually find the way that the accessibility tree looks by opening up the accessibility dev tools in our browser. So we go to the Elements panel if you go in Chrome or Firefox or any browser you're using, including Safari as well. We go to the Elements panel. we can open up the accessibility tab on the right-hand side. Now, sometimes you might have to click the arrows pointing right to open them. And if you're an assisted user, you would also have that menu spoken to you using your screen reader of choice. So here we can see we have the breakdown of the accessibility for our dropdown. We have our button, which has the text branch 8 preferred. This is just one example of one branch, one project, the actively or the selected branch. In this case, the branch 8 is preferred. It has a focusable attribute, focused and expanded. These come by default to the button element. And so this is fine so far, but it doesn't tell us other than the fact that it's not expanded, which is good that it does show us that this button isn't expanded. But I want to draw your attention to this. This is good. But the other thing that we're missing is the aria label. So it's really important to stop here and look at this, because even if you think that this is accessible, it might have some concerns. That's why tools like the A11Y and AX testing tools, which DQ provides, are really important. They give us an indicator of some potential accessibility concerns that we might want to address. But DQ might actually not tell us that, or the accessibility tools provided by DQ or AX might not tell us that this is a potential concern. One of the concerns here is that there's no aria label here, even though it does have text for the button, which is branch 8 preferred. It's not actually giving us any indication of what will happen when we click on this button. So how many branches are actually available in this dropdown? So far, it's just a button. And this is kind of misleading. And I think this is where the merging of UX and accessibility come into play. I think this is one of the themes of my talk, that when you look at an accessibility tree, you can get a better idea of what's actually happening, and definitely go and use a screen reader. But for this is kind of our quick fix. This is what we do instead of running a screen reader each time. And we do also run the DQ accessibility linting tools, AXXE, but we also look almost always at the accessibility tree to figure out if there's any problems. And here we can see we're missing the aria label. So let's address that and add in an aria label. But before I do that, I want to give a shout out to DQ for their accessibility tools. And like I mentioned before, this is the tools that we use to automate our accessibility linting. So the first one is, of course, Axe Core. You're probably already familiar with this. And the next one we use, which is for Ember, is the Ember A11Y testing. This adds hooks into our testing framework, which in this case is QUnit, and it allows us to run our automated tests against the AXXE core library that's available and open sourced from DQ. And when we write our test, it looks like this. This is JavaScript code. We write test, it passes accessibility audit as the test name. We have a few other properties that we need to pass into our component, including the project itself. So this particular component has a branch argument, which would be a prop if you're in React or Vue. And it also has project ID, which don't really concern us. The part that we really care about is here. We await the A11Y audit helper, which tells us whether the accessibility linting passes or fails. Now, I can go on and show you all the accessibility linting that we found throughout this tool, but I think a lot of other talks will go over that. So instead of showing you guys all the really cool tools that DQ has provided, which are plentiful and bountiful, I want to show you the way that we solved this problem using our using the dev tools themselves without going into any extensions or using the Axe developer extension that's available on the Chrome Web Store or the Firefox add-on store. So to address this problem, we first have the power select, and then we have in the else statement we have the whenever there's no other branches available, we just show the we have an icon and we have a paragraph tag. So the first one is if we're showing the dropdown, we show the power select, and then the other one is if we don't have it, then we just show the normal bolded text. So to address this, we add in an aria label. Now the aria label is camel cased, or so basically it we use the aria label without a dash. That's because this particular component, power select, doesn't support passing in aria label. It overrides it with its own value if you look at the source code. So we have to pass in aria label. Normally we would be able to pass in aria label through ... arguments, but in this case we don't. We just pass it in through the named argument, which is called aria label. And then we pass in a translation. T is just our translation helper, and it indicates to our basic layer framework, it's a localized value. So if you've ever used any localization libraries before, or INTL, this helps for users of different nationalities to understand our application. The second change that we made after adding an aria label to our main dropdown component was to add a description list. Now, some of you guys might know the description list, the DL element. This helps us to assign keys and values to the markup. So instead of having a p tag, we can have a key and a value. The key in this case would be the preferred branch. So if you can imagine preferred branch colon and then the name of the branch. So to do that, to achieve that, first of all, we add a hidden, only a screen reader only class to make sure that we don't really care to show the cited user that this is the active branch, because it's already clear from the context. Based on our UX studies, we found that we didn't need it. So we only show the branch icon and the branch name for the cited users. And for the screen readers, we indicate that this particular branch is the preferred branch, or the currently selected branch. And we put in the translation in the DT tag. In the DD tag, we put in the branch name, as we did before. But this helps for our screen reader. So again, the first change, we added in the aria label. And then once we do that, we see that our accessibility linting passes. So that's basically the first part for the accessible dropdown. Before I get started on the next topic, I will field for any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So everyone, this is Josh McClure from DQ. I have a question here in the Q&A from Nico. He says, or they said, I like that the Ember Power Select library has no dependencies. Do you know if there is a similar library in React?
I don't know in particular about React. I wish I could give you more information about that. But one thing to note is that if you do want to look into it, I highly suggest checking out the select menu element, which has no dependencies and is native to the browser. And you can enable the select menu with a feature flag in Chrome and see if it suits your needs. There are a number of different options available if you're in the React world. So definitely look and peruse those packaged JSON files to determine what dependencies. I actually advise that for anybody as well. When you're going through any kind of tool that you're adding to your stack, look at the dependencies. And a lot of the issues that we uncover, at least on our front end with our own tool for scanning potential security issues, they come from those adding dependencies. And you might also have seen some of these warnings when you do an npm install. You see 6-8 vulnerabilities found in the red text. So, but my suggestion is to look for native elements, and if you can, potentially use the select native element, which has built-in accessibility with it already, or you can look to like the data list attribute and add that to an input type equal to search if you really want to have some more fun. But I don't know of any specific libraries that don't have any dependencies. I don't use React, so I don't know too much about it. But maybe you can go and look online and find some libraries that suit your needs, or use the native elements, which is probably preferable.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I'd say if anybody in the audience has some suggestions, definitely post those in the ideas. We'd love to share that and get your feedback. Sean, I got one more for you here.
Yeah, sounds good.
Why was the aria label required if there was static HTML text present?
Yes, great question. So again, that's the overlap between the UX side. And so there's an overlap here between the UX side of what our customers expect and what the DQ accessibility tools will tell us. So this is really important to understand that sometimes you might run some accessibility user testing and find that your users don't necessarily understand what's happening. And if there's an understanding gap there, then it makes a lot of sense to try to address that through you can use the aria label to help tell the user that, okay, this is what's going to happen when you open that dropdown. This is a concept called affordance in the UX world. And I actually think it has a real application in the accessibility world, because a lot of times screen readers will navigate, or assisted users will navigate to different elements and not know what's going to happen. So I think for us, the biggest reason we use this relates to helping our assisted users understand the affordance of opening and closing each dropdown. Is there any? Do we have any other questions?
I think that's all we got so far.
All right, awesome. So let's move on to the next part. Let's talk about our accessibility. So we talked about our dropdowns. Now let's talk about our accessible file upload. So part of our cloud-based issue manager involves generating reports. Now, if you've ever used the Axe tools, which we talked about earlier, there are libraries to display reports, such as the Axe report generator, which generates PDF documents for upper management to review accessibility concerns without needing to open developer tools and use the Axe extension. We were tasked with adding an upload form to add a custom logo to each generated report for potential and existing security vulnerabilities. So here's an example of the custom upload that you can see here. Pictured in the screenshot, we can see a form titled Report Customization with 2 checkboxes. The first checkbox toggles the visibility of a text area, and that allows us to add specific text to our reports that get generated and then generate a PDF, which the upper management can then download and then send off to the security team to analyze what needs to get addressed. In the same way that you might have accessibility concerns from DQ's A11Y tools or the Axe toolset tools that we mentioned earlier, you could send that report off to management and determine which accessibility concerns it makes the most sense to address. Of course, again, with the theme, always do the user testing to find out what your assisted users require. Anyway, so we can see here we have those 2 checkboxes, and the second one toggles a form input. And in this case, we already have a custom logo attached that will get added to each generated form. As well, we have, when we toggle this, we show the form, and then when we click on the X button, which is just a circle with an X inside of it, it's a button, and then it removes the images. So when we click on the remove, we get an upload image form, which is a button, and then we have a queue or a label which says drag or drop the file here. So like any other upload form, when we click on this upload image, then we get prompted to upload an image or a file. And there's a maximum here. It says 500 kilobytes, and we need to enforce that. So when we take a look, we use a tool called Ember Inspector to figure out which particular component is responsible for rendering this upload component. And we have a bunch of arguments that we pass in here, and we can click on the eye icon to show or hide to highlight the actual element. There are very similar tools in all the other frameworks, so definitely have a look and see if you have a tool available to try to debug as well. Anyway, let's take a look at how we did the form here. So this is pretty beefy already. You can see we have a field set. That's one of the more important details that we've taken upon ourselves to do, is to have field sets with legends to help group our forms. The other nice thing about field sets is that it helps us to tell screen readers what each group is named. So the field set is part of the HTML5 specification, and it also requires, or ideally has, a legend as the first item in the field set inside of it. And the legend tells the screen reader what this group corresponds to. So starting from the top, we have our field set, we have a legend, and then we have an input. And so the input is actually what we care about here, because the input will tell us, will show or hide the report. And so the input itself is a helper in Ember, and basically it's built into Ember, and it has two-way binding built in. And so that's why it's uppercase as opposed to lowercase on the input element. And so the important part here that we need to do for accessibility is to have an ID associated with the input This is something that we oftentimes see our developers forget to do, and they forget to have an ID and a label associated with each input. This is important for screen readers to tell them what this input is responsible for. So just like you would in a UI, when you select a text or a text area or an input, you want to know what that particular text area means or what it's responsible for. And so we have a label, and inside that label, we also have the maximum indicated as well for the screen reader to know that, okay, I can't upload any images past, was it 200 kilobytes? So that's over here. And then we internationalize that as well, as we showed you earlier with the T helper, and then we pass that in. So that results in this here. We can see add a custom logo to all reports, max 500 kilobytes, and then we get that. So let's take a look at the accessibility tree and the way that it looks now. So as I mentioned earlier, we have our main tag, and our main tag, inside our main tag, we have our section for report customizations. And because we use the correct semantic HTML, inside the section, we have a heading and a paragraph, and then another section. And then inside that section, which is a form, we have different groups, and the group corresponds to the field set that we described earlier. So we can see here, add a custom logo is the group name. And then we can see on the right-hand side, we have different aria attributes, but the form legend corresponds to the group. The next part that we'll talk about is the file drop zone, which is an existing component that we just brought in from another library. And the file drop zone basically allows us to drag and drop files dynamically. And out of the box, the accessibility is just okay. And we did some assessments with our users, and we found that what we're missing is the status indicator of how the upload is actually doing. So how far did the upload get, and what happens if it fails? What about the error states? We need to communicate those to our screen readers and help them understand the problem so that they can better diagnose it and then continue and perhaps upload another file, for example, if it exceeds the 500 kilobyte file limit. So here we have our file drop zone, and we pass in on drag enter, which are basically just callbacks. In the React world, you might end up having this all in line, which is frankly probably why I don't like React. Maybe it's just me. I don't know, but we get these we try to limit the amount of logic in our templates. That's one of the big advantages and the reasons I really like Ember is that we don't have a lot of logic in our templates. So notice that we really do try to limit the amount of logic in our templates, and that helps us to reason about our code a little bit easier in a declarative way when we look at our HTML, in this case, handlebars. Anyway, we have our disabled that uses a not helper, which we could also have in the component itself. So our templates are very separate from our components. That's something in the Ember world that is very specific in a way to Ember. Although Angular, you can have something similar where you have your HTML files. Anyway, we have our drop zone, and then we have in our drop zone, what we did to address the status accessibility concern is we use this element called the output. A lot of people don't know about the output element. The output element is so helpful, and it has helped us in a number of ways to improve our accessibility. So for those of you who don't know, the output element, basically if you had like say a calculation 2 plus 2 in your form, you had two inputs, type equal to number, then the output would help to tell us what it equals. So what is 2 plus 2? It is 4. The output would basically house that result for the calculation. In the same way, we have our status of the uploading file. It is a result of uploading our file. Therefore, we can nest that status inside the output element, and we correspond the element of the output element to an input using the for attribute. So that happens here. We pass in the component ID, and then we pass in an arbitrary, a string to make it more human readable. Because if we just had Ember 234, which is generated from this component ID, it wouldn't really help us to understand what it actually serves. So it's also important for the developer experience to keep our IDs human readable as well. And that's an effort that we make as well using some of the built-in libraries that Ember gives us, which is our GUID4. Now, this is always going to be a unique ID. It's generated on the fly. So that gives us the reliability that this output will always be associated with this particular upload component. If we had more upload components, it would still be reliable. So that's also important for us and our screen readers. So that output element, what do we get? When we add that element in there, we can see a status with an atomic true. The atomic true means that any change whatsoever will be announced to the screen reader. And that's kind of important here because say if we had an upload progress, sometimes we might want to tell the screen reader, okay, you're 30%, you're 40%, you're 50%. But all other times, the screen reader might not want to know that, well, it's 50% done. But in this case, we actually do want to be very specific about the status and tell the screen reader, yes, you're 50%, you're 60%. Oh no, there was an error. And that's why atomic true is important, but we get that out of the box with the output element. Now, remember, of course, no aria is the best aria. So we use the output element here to convey the status and associate it with the responsible input. And we do that through the output element. So here we go. This is what an error looks like. And so we get our file here. File exceeds 500 kilobytes. And then, of course, we also have the error message here. And if we have errors, this is the next part that I want to show you guys. It's called dialog. So the dialog element is fairly new. It came in HTML 5.1, and now it's in HTML 5.2 if you follow the specification. And the dialog itself tells the screen reader that this particular error can be dismissed, but it would be the equivalent of role equal to dialog. So for some screen readers, we found that they didn't support the dialog element. So we also add in role equal to dialog. The other thing that's important is to have an aria label or an aria labeled by. And unfortunately, we just don't have that here, but that's something that we could definitely do as an improvement and help to convey to the user what the error message actually is. And we might do that through an aria labeled by and then have an ID on the paragraph tag that gets housed in the dialog element, and we might assign it through the ID. So we can see here we add the dialog, and that gives us in the screen in the accessibility tree, we see the dialog and modal false. In this case, we don't want a modal dialog because, well, it's just there and it's going to stay there. But the nice thing about this is that it follows the status element. So anytime the screen reader wants to find out what the status is, they can always tab over and go to the next dialog to find out what's happening. And that's kind of striking the balance there between nagging the screen reader, telling them about the updates and telling them about the errors, and then giving them the possibility to learn more about those errors if they so choose. Telling the screen reader, oh, you messed up, this is an error, and constantly nagging them and telling them they're wrong, that can kind of reduce the morale. And so again, test with your users, find out what makes sense, and determine the most sensible approach for giving your screen readers feedback and announcing. This is the announceability aspect that I discussed earlier. So once we do that, we find that our customers are rather happy and they're mostly satisfied with the way that we've done our file upload component. Now, of course, it's an ongoing effort, but for the most part, that was the approach that we took. So I will open up the floor for any questions now, if there are any, and then we can move on to the final one.
So there are no questions at the moment. If anybody has a question, we'll gladly accept it. But I think this is a really interesting topic. And Sean, I can definitely say from my experience, I've seen modern day web applications really utilizing these kinds of features and interfaces. So definitely on the rise. Do you find that linting is a successful pattern to start with, and it seems like you maybe supplement with other UI testing on top of that?
Yeah, I'm getting a few questions there, and the answer is no. I don't think that linting is maintainable for us, and that's a learning that we've had over the last year, actually. So even though I did show you guys the A11Y testing tool that is available to us in Ember, we really haven't leveraged it that much internally. Unfortunately, the fact is that we don't really get the amount of time that we would like to go through all the accessibility concerns, and the usability testing itself, or the accessibility testing, that comes in more use to us than going to using these like the DQ, A11Y, Axe tools. the reality is that we only can do something if we have like a ticket or an issue, and we have like a whole system dedicated to taking on accessibility that often gets ignored, unfortunately. So uh, part of the effort that we've been making, that I've been making, because I specialize mostly in accessibility and other things as well, and HTML is a big passion of mine. I think it's really not feasible for us to address all the accessibility concerns. So the priority becomes figuring out which accessibility concerns to address. And for us, we find that accessibility testing is the best way if we have the affordance to do so. If we don't, then looking at the accessibility tree for me is usually the go-to. And writing semantic HTML, honestly, if you do that, a lot of these features will come out of the box, like using the dialogue, like using output. So I think that it's not feasible for us. It might be feasible for other projects and other teams, but for us, we just don't have the bandwidth to focus on all of the linting errors that we see from the AX6E, which could be an indicator for just us not following the having semantic HTML. But I do think that our HTML is really quite semantic. You've seen some examples. I think that there's just so many edge cases and so many different situations, and Axe does a good job of outlining those generally. But I think the accessibility testing does serve us more in terms of figuring out what to do and how to approach our accessibility in general.
It's awesome.
Great. So any other questions?
Not at this moment. We got about 12 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm gonna finish up. This next one is pretty quick here. So
Awesome.
sorry. Oops. So finally, I'll talk to you guys about the accessible search. So this is a search that we see in our filters. So pictured here on the slide, you can see we have our main dashboard sort of layout here, but on the main content landmark, we have a list of dropdowns. So at least 6 or 7, actually about 10, and they're displayed in line, and they all have different toggles. One of them is issue status, another is severity, triage status, issue kind, issue type, and so on. And these all trigger dropdowns. And these dropdowns have dynamic search, and we can see that here. And in the screenshot, we can see opened owner, and in there we can see as we type, we can filter dynamically. And so we can see here the list of results. And if we look at the accessibility, we can see search box, which comes from the input type equal to search. And if we go down to the field set, we can see our input path select, which is just the same thing as what I showed you. It's just a different component to display the path. We use the legend again. And of course, that gives us the status text, which we're very happy about. And of course, in our search input, then we have our search input and our checkbox select. The checkbox select displays the items themselves that get displayed, and then we can select them. And then those would then make the changes in real time as we go through the filters, and we add more filters to modify the list view or the results in our list. So the first change that I made is that we added an output element. And so the output element itself, that was the first approach that we took. So we had our search input. When we change our search input, we changed the results. So we nested all the checkbox select. After that, we found that actually didn't work. So output isn't always the solution. We do get a status list, but that doesn't really make sense to screen readers when they read it. So always go and check your screen reader. So that doesn't work. So instead, we actually added an attribute called aria live polite. And what that does is that announces any changes to the content as they change. So for example, if we're filtering by the checkbox or we're filtering the filters themselves, and we're searching in the search input, then we want to indicate to the screen reader that those contents have changed. And so for that, we can additionally use aria controls. And so when a user agent supports aria controls, it makes it possible for focus to be moved from the current element directly to the element it controls. And so we add aria controls in addition to that, and we assign it with an ID. And so we add again this component ID and assign it to a list. And so when we open up voiceover in Mac OS, we can actually get an indicator of what this looks like. and it tells us we're currently on a text field. And as we search, it announces us only the changes. So for example, Ashley Brown, 1, unassigned, 3, those are the values that change. And this is great. So this works really well for us in terms of the accessibility of our search. So with that in mind, that basically shows you the way that our screen readers have, we had improved the accessibility for our screen readers. And that's the general approach that we took. So again, there's one last thing that I will say before we take any final questions. There are nested, in some cases, we have nested checkboxes. So here we can see a recognized priority list, which are just a number of different types of vulnerabilities, and we can search by the type of list of the vulnerabilities. So we have like 2010 CWE on the cusp and so on. So when we have nested items, then the accessibility gets even more complex. And so we can see here in the screenshot that we have a button focusable for each individual dropdown itself. But what we don't have is any indicator for the nested values and whether they're expanded or not. And that's not existent. We can tell that from going in the screen reader and navigating and tapping through the dropdown contents. And that's definitely missing. So to address that, we would have to use the aria tree roll, and that requires a lot of heavy lifting. So we haven't done that yet, and that's definitely something that we want to do in the future. So with that in mind, I want to thank you guys all, and I will take any questions. And of course, if you do know how to do the aria tree roll, which I've described, we definitely would love your help. And as well, if you're a front-end developer and you know Ember.js and you would like to work with helping us on our accessibility, send over your resume on synopsys.com/careers. And you can also tweet me on Twitter at SGORESHT. So I want to thank you guys all for your time, and I will take any questions.
Wonderful. Such a good presentation. Very, very excellent topic. We do have a handful of questions. One of the topics that seems to be trending here is screen reader testing. So, obviously you guys are doing some amount of automated testing, but can you speak about what you do after your automated testing with screen reader and maybe some user acceptance testing?
Right. So honestly, it depends, right? So do you have access to a user that you can go through and listen to them using the screen reader, listen to the pace of the screen reader? You can set screen readers to go very, very fast. And can you follow that? Can you understand the problems that they're having? I think, honestly, finding your user and finding your target user and what their situation is like, that's the most important thing. And so setting up meetings with them, getting in touch with your UX team if you do have one. If not, making an effort to contact your customers who might be using these agents. And you can use browser sniffing to do that, to check as well. But I don't suggest that. I think for us, we found the balance between linting and accessibility testing to lean far more towards the accessibility testing, like manual accessibility testing through screen readers, as well as checking the accessibility tree, like I showcased earlier in this presentation. So between those two, we don't lean so much towards the automated testing so much anymore, as much as we lean towards the user experience accessibility testing, as well as looking at the accessibility tree in the dev tools.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, it's absolutely important. And you're building a component library, right? You're not on the team that's building the actual like front end interfaces. Is that correct in understanding?
No, so we have different delivery teams. I work on the on a delivery team called Phoenix. We have different teams, and each team gets assigned different issues. I take on issues as well as a number of other developers relating to the issue management itself. So we used to have a team dedicated to only doing like managing the component library, but we've pretty much disbanded that in favor of making features specific, like features to specific parts of our domain. For example, issue management, as we branch out and add in more features to different sections of our cloud-based platform.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was gonna say testing the component libraries. I know a lot of teams kind of build component libraries, and then those are used by other teams who are then building the composite views and pages. But yeah, I mean, include automated testing and include the screen reader and user acceptance testing in your process. That's definitely going to be very helpful. All right, we got about 4 minutes left, so I'm gonna rush through a couple of questions here. Great questions, everyone in the audience, by the way. One of the other big questions here is, sounds like most of your users are in the latest browsers, which is great. Do you have a process for if or when they aren't? Do you create any fallback?
Yeah. I remember we had one earlier and we just put won't fix. And I think they were using an old version of NVDA or JAWS. And we said upgrade to the latest browser. And if you don't, well, we're not supporting you. So sounds like we give a little middle finger, but in fact, we're actually advocating the best accessible experience. So it can be hard to update your whole system, I know, but for us, we're making software for developers, and so our customer base generally does have the capacity to update their versions of their screen readers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good stuff. Does your team have a strategy for Node.js?
That's a very general question. Can we get more specific about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna assume this means are there any fallbacks for like a no JavaScript?
Oh, I think you said Node.js. I didn't hear you say Node.js. Okay. No, we just don't. Our product only works with JavaScript. Now, there is Ember Fastboot if you're interested in building isomorphic applications in Ember. I have used that extensively in some other projects, but we don't use Ember Fastboot at all, which would basically serve the application without JavaScript. So at this point, we only support clients that have JavaScript enabled.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that seems to be an industry standard that I've kind of been seeing. All right, one last question here. Will the contents of Dialog Element be announced similar to a live region?
Again, going back to my example, if I can find it. So if we go to the dialog, we were actually missing the aria labeled by. So no, the answer is no. You need to add an aria labeled by or an aria label to your dialog. Like here, you can see there's no label there. If we look at the inspector here, it's pictured on the right-hand side. We can see the accessibility inspector, and it just says modal, and it doesn't give us any other information to the screen reader. So to fix that, we need to add an aria label or an aria labeled by. Preferably, I almost always go to the aria labeled by, and I also supplement that usually with an aria described by, because by default, even most of the newer screen readers, they don't support dialog. So we want to add role equal to dialog or alert dialog, and then also add in the aria described by and aria labeled by or aria label.
Wonderful. Well, I think we have reached the end of this session. Sean, that was a wonderful presentation, great content. Really appreciate you taking the time, and everyone in the audience, thank you for being here. I'd also like to say thank you to Whitney and Hay, our ASL or interpreters. So please keep enjoying the sessions and continue with these great questions and feedback. We love hearing it.